9 months after launching, we've got a first on Sport Unlocked, an episode recorded in front of a live audience. It came at the Leaders Week Sports Business Conference at Twickenham Stadium. Myself, Harris and Martyn Ziegler were joined by a revolving series of guests just as the takeover of Newcastle United was unfolding. Take a listen to a very special episode 37 of Sport Unlocked. Excellent. Well, thanks a lot for everyone joining us. Well, Sport Unlocked started in January, finally, at the start of a particularly busy year that we never quite anticipated. We asked in the first one questions like, would there be a Super League this year? Would that happen? Are the big issues around the Olympics? And it's been great to try to shed some light on some of the sports news issues. For any of you who don't know me, I'm Rob Harris from the Associated Press. And rare to say, alongside me, Martyn Ziegler from the Times in person. How have you found it?
It's been good. I mean, it was. We also have a regular guest, Tariq Panja from the New York Times, who comes on a lot. Interestingly, we sort of talked to. I talked to Tariq about a year ago about doing a podcast, and he said, "Oh yeah, we should get Rob involved as well." So we spoke to Rob, and Rob had already registered the names everywhere, Sport Unlocked. So this had been his master plan for some time, it looks like, and it's been really good actually. Hopefully we can give some opinionated analysis of the big issues. We at the moment we're number 15 amongst sports podcasts in Paraguay, so we're clearly doing very well.
Well, we know Commonwealth are listening, and the one advantage of having a crowd is if you've got any questions, you can actually fire them back at us rather than having to just mention all the social accounts at Sport Unlocked on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And for all those marketing people, that was one of the key things, not finding a name that had underscores required and things like that. But as is the nature of the pod, very often it very much comes together at the last minute. We're sort of thrown together, getting guests coming in, trying to work out what the news issues will be of the week. And that's very much how it is now, because as we're sitting here, we're waiting for the final confirmation of the Newcastle takeover by the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia. We're expecting it to come, so we're keeping an eye. And we've got some rotating guests. And fortunately, who better to call on first but a former Premier League executive himself, Nick Coward, from the formerly the Premier League, formerly the General Secretary. And if I could ask him to come up now to get some insight. Thanks.
We've got your Premier League notebook there, I see. Is it?
I thought it was appropriate, even though you only gave me 10 minutes notice.
Such is the way. So for those who don't know, what are your current hats at the moment?
Oh, well, currently I'm, most recently I've joined a fabulous bunch of people at Portis Consulting, which is relevant to this, actually, as we perhaps go through the conversation. UK Athletics, England Golf, various sporting consultancies and lots of stuff elsewhere, a lot around the world. And those of you who know me know I can't go very far without talking about the Pro Kabaddi League in India and the growth of Indian sport, the Indian sport economy, which is one of my real obsessions now.
Well, we start off on Newcastle. One of the key parts of this takeover has been so protracted, going back 4 years when Amanda Staveley first expressed interest in buying Newcastle. Then it all heated up last year when the Public Investment Fund came back in. They tried to launch the £300 million takeover then. We had beIN Sports in particular complaining about the piracy from Saudi Arabia of their rights, from the Qatari-owned broadcaster, Amnesty raising human rights concerns as well, Premier League stalling on approval of the ownership because they had questions over who would ultimately be in control of Newcastle with the Public Investment Fund run by Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi Crown Prince. Fast forward now to 2021, it looks like the Premier League have had their concerns alleviated in terms of who will be in control. Have you ever known a takeover like this, now viewing from the outside as well from the inside, just how protracted it's been and how fraught?
Well, it's interesting. Obviously not involved for 5 years, but as General Secretary of the Premier League, obviously there were similar processes. And I think that's the key point to say. There are, as you know, Martyn, there are clear rules and regulations, and there's some very good people, seriously minded people who go through the process that they've applied previously, that they will apply in the future, unless and until it's changed. And yeah, it's a dynamic process. I suppose the dynamic process will take as long as it takes, but that's the process. I think one of the things to remember here as well is, and you have both experienced this, one of the great qualities of the Premier League, I think one of the defining features, and something I talk to a lot of people about around the world, is a great hallmark of a successful league or a competition is that you do have a seriously trusted and credible bunch of people sitting in the middle doing their job. But, the whole without fear and favour, and doing it absolutely for the best interest of the league at all times. And I think there's always going to be a consequence from that, yes, here are the rules, here are the regulations, this is what we've all agreed we're going to do, and we are going to do it. And I think you can see that in play in everything I think that the Premier League and other equivalent leagues do with a similar kind of test-based system. And I think this process will have done the same thing. And I think whoever you are in that process, ultimately, I think people will always respect it as having been carried out right, properly, objectively, in that seriously minded way, which will deliver the best outcome, I think, for the league.
What do you think about the Premier League adopting a human rights aspect to the owners and directors test? This is something Amnesty is calling for, because it's not something which is clearly not there at the moment, and there are, we've got Saudi Arabia at the moment, but in the future it could be an even more unpleasant dictatorship. Is that something you think sport can address? I
think it's a really interesting time to be asking these questions, and obviously there is a process under which not just the Premier League, but the FA, the EFL, government, let's face it, are thinking about it here in the UK. And it's a question, I think, which certainly in football and other sports where we've got, effectively an open system approach, I think the whole question of ownership is an interesting one to reflect on. And maybe this is going to be the first time for quite some considerable time that people will have to think about it. I mean, the context is all, and the context obviously of English professional football is, let's 100 and however many years, and a system which has never really had to ask itself that question in the same way as when I'm working with leagues and competitions. What you're trying to work out is, well, what's the objective? What's your outcome? Who's got what roles and responsibilities? What are the incentives you're going to put in place to make that happen? And that often comes down to owners. What's the role of the owner? What's the role of the competition, the league, and the owners? And that hasn't happened really in a system such as the Premier League, as opposed to many others. It's interesting the approach that I think is being taken. I think when the Tracy Crouch review kind of unfolds in the coming weeks and months, I think her for those of you who follow this, and I think this is probably a bit UK focused, but it's interesting to then think about in the rest of the world. Her letter does ask serious and searching questions. It gets wrapped up in the concept of an independent regulator, but I think most importantly, look behind that and look at the questions that really is looking at. What it's really raising is, what's the question I think I've just asked, what's the role of the owner in the context of this financial system, this economic system, this sporting system, which has got is so important to so many people, and let's maybe for the first time work out what it is that a, quotes, good owner looks like. Because you'll remember, you will have had many conversations with Premier League leadership over the years, and including, I suppose, Richard Scudamore mostly, when his answer would be is to that kind of question that you pose. What we're looking for here is a good owner, as in an owner that will contribute to the best outcome for the Premier League and all that the Premier League can achieve, not just in terms of success for the league and the competitions in terms of, I suppose, financial success, but sporting success as a lead player for the nation. A good football citizen, I suppose, is a phrase as well that you will have heard many times. And I think that was never particularly articulated. You wouldn't find that written down anywhere. There are lots of tests as to what a good owner won't do. And I think one of the good things in the Tracy Crouch letter is to highlight all those heritage issues that will not be, I suppose, addressed or changed without proper consent, people really thinking about it properly. And I think everyone will say yes to that. What it then needs to move on perhaps is, in the overall system, what do we really want owners to be? How do we want them to contribute? How do we want them to take this sport, this league forward? And I think ultimately that's going to be a challenge for. I think there's great people actually. One of the things which I would observe now, and I think it's been the case for a long time, is there's a lot of really good people at the league, the Premier League, the EFL, and the FA. And I think working together, I think there's a real appetite to address these issues for the next stage of English football.
One of the fundamental challenges when it comes to takeovers, and we're seeing particularly with Newcastle now, when we see it when sports are deciding where to take their events to, you'll see it in athletics as well. Should sport apply a higher moral standard than government? Because some would look at the Newcastle situation and say, well, Boris Johnson's government still deals with the Saudis, despite the Khashoggi killing, of which there was links to Mohammed bin Salman and how much he knew on it. So should sport apply a higher moral code because it can do? It doesn't have to think like a government. That's not for me, Rob. But I'm going to turn it around and say, here is a system, here is a league which does stand for a lot, and here are people. And I'm talking about this narrow question. I'm talking about anyone who wants to get involved in the Premier League or English football. You know, here is something which has got huge history, huge importance, and you're buying into it to be part of it. And so I think people should look at that and think, yes, these are people who do want to and understand that this is something incredibly precious and important, and they are going to be part of it. And frankly, all the good, all the good that can achieve, not just, in British society, but around the world. One of the things which I know you comment on and are part of is that massive contribution through sport to a lot of societies. And I see that again, bringing it back to India, just how galvanizing and effective sport can be, whether it be kabaddi or cricket or football or whatever, in terms of creating positive change. I think anyone coming into a system like the Premier League absolutely will know that, and that's what they're going to be part of, and that's what they'll help be part of going forward.
What, Nick, there was a sort of famous text message that was revealed earlier this year that Mohammed bin Salman sent to Boris Johnson saying, can you get the Premier League to correct its decision? And certainly from what I understand, there's quite a lot. You're
just not going to stop with these little questions, are you?
You can't hit mute unlike when we're doing remotely.
Not specifically on that, but it's just, and from what I understand, there was quite a lot of pressure from number 10 to the Premier League last year, and actually it stood firm with its position there. But from your experience, do you get government pressure to do certain things, take certain decisions?
Well, I think you just answered your own question, which takes me back to my first answer, which is you've got seriously minded people who know they've got a job to do and will do it. Mm. And if that means withstanding, as you describe it, pressures from places, that's what they will do. Mm. So I think, and that's what you do in terms of building trust and confidence. This is your job, I'll do it. And you'll get on with it. And I said, bringing it all the way back to that question I've posed through this, actually the really difficult bit, but the hard bit, the most important bit is to work out what you're all in it for, whose role is it to do what, who's going to be held, to whom are you accountable for that, and then let people get on with the best possible job to achieve that. And in terms of the Premier League, and you can take it into US sports and other really great sporting examples around the world, with the complexity and the context that English professional football has, which I think pretty much trumps most others in terms of its complexity, as opposed to, say, a franchise-based model, or we've just been hearing from the one championship owner, downstairs in another room, and that very simple model of having no owners, nothing else really to worry about apart from creating compelling content. That's, if you compare that to the Premier League and how they go about their job, I think we should all be confident they'll come to a really good outcome. Well,
Nick, it's been great to get you at this very late notice coming up on stage.
I was going to say thank you, but I'm not sure. So no, thank you. Great to see you.
It's been really great, Nick, and I'm of that generation who remembers kabaddi being shown on Channel 4. I think it was just before Football Italia or just after. In the
Absolutely
1990s.
Was, yeah.
Hopefully we can get it back on again.
That's my mission. So hopefully, yes. Pro Kabaddi League starting the 22nd of December. Therefore, that's my last plug.
Nick,
thanks very much.
Nick Howard,
thanks.
Formerly of the Premier League. Nick treading a bit delicately on some of the matters, naturally, but to get more insight on the Middle Eastern perspective, join now. We've got Lee Wellings to come up now. Lee's formerly sports correspondent at Al Jazeera. For many years before then, BBC, Sky, Channel 5, if anyone remembers the early days of the...
There's more hair then.
Yeah, perching on the desk. And now you've got a book coming out as well, The Dilly Dong Bell.
I have, yeah. Well, I'm hoping the timing's quite good with this book, because the central story in it is Claudio Ranieri, of course, the Dilly Dong Bell. A big thing in it is kind, empathetic leadership, actually. So hopefully that's timely as well. And with him being appointed Watford manager this week, so I'm hoping the timing works out quite well. But that's just one of the stories in the book. It's actually about sport and society and morals, and a lot of the things we're talking about here now actually run through the book with sports examples of real life issues, because sport does reflect society, doesn't it?
And of course, you were working for Al Jazeera, Qatari-owned broadcaster, so you're right in the heart and the thick of how sport intersects with Middle East politics. You've been a step removed for the last year. How have you followed this Newcastle story unfolding? And is it good or bad for the Premier League, Saudi Arabia getting involved? You know, for Abu Dhabi already has Manchester City, Qatar already has Paris Saint-Germain as well.
Well, I was thinking about this, and maybe it's appropriate that Newcastle were the club involved this time, because we want everything to be black and white, don't we? I mean, the fans do, and I'm not blaming the fans for that. They want their team to win football matches. There's a sense of entitlement there. This is our time. And there has to be consistency for them. You can't have one club benefiting from money that is, you know, doubted and raises eyebrows, and then another club, you know, not able to do that. So I think consistency is important in this, but also the issue is complicated. And I think, you know, to follow that sense of entitlement through, well, why is this not happening, almost that you're suffering, I think that's taking it a bit far, actually. I think that, you know, we've got to remember sport's important to so many people. It's been my working life for 30 years, but we also have to understand what real suffering is. And it's not your team losing a football match. It really isn't. So I think that some of the perspective goes when we start to get involved with who owns our football club, who owns our sports teams. And actually, it's that uncomfortable relationship, isn't it, between big business and sport. I don't think it's ever properly settled down. And I think it's fascinating, because I don't think it will, where there's double standards all over the place, aren't there?
Yeah, so I mean, this whole setup of this Newcastle takeover to me is really interesting. So you've got the Saudi Public Investment Fund is going to be an 80% shareholder. The Premier League have somehow come to a view that the Saudi Arabia state will not be involved in the running of the club, but the Saudi PIF, which is led by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is. Can you see how they are able to separate that? Because I can't.
Well, I've been trying desperately to find what the separation is. I mean, is there separation that we haven't been made aware of? If there was, surely they would have made us aware of it so that we can see that this is all above board. I mean, it feels to me like the Premier League has been persuaded enough that they should go through to this. I don't think they're entirely satisfied. Have they come out and said they're absolutely satisfied by this? I think they're satisfied enough that there feels now that this should be the legal path forward, because there doesn't seem to be anything illegal, to my knowledge, about what's going on. And therefore we go back to morals, and how far do you take morals in sport? I mean, you know, I'm really interested to ask Newcastle fans in this instance what they really want, because, you know, you can talk to them and some of them are still conflicted. It's not just, I saw 93% are in favour. Well, broadly they might be, but actually you still can't completely separate, I don't think, football and society. And I think a really good example of that is my own club growing up, Liverpool. When Jurgen Klopp was appointed, genuinely, I was so absolutely delighted that such a great human being had been appointed, which sounds a bit trite, doesn't it, from a journalist? Oh, how lovely, how wonderful, what a great human being. Is he going to win football matches? I'm one of very few Liverpool fans I know that still want Jurgen Klopp at the club for the leader he is and how much people want to play for him and what he does for society beyond football, which I think, I never thought I'd get into that stage, but over the past few years, it's become really important to me to see the empathy and kindness in leadership, not just whether your team wins, which I know is always going to be important. And I think that there's a lesson in there and in Klopp at Liverpool, because of course people will talk about his trophies and results, but it's the man he is. Now, what do Newcastle want? And actually, that's why I brought the phone up here. It's my favourite quote probably ever in sport, which will be familiar to a lot of you. Bobby Robson, Newcastle man. What is a club in any case? Not the buildings or the directors or the people who are paid to represent it. It's not the television contracts, get-out clauses, marketing departments or executive boxes. It's the noise, the passion, the feelings of belonging, the pride in your city. And I think he goes on to talk about that feeling you first get when you walk up and you see the grass for the first time as a kid, maybe with a parent or someone who's taking you to the game. I think that shouldn't be completely forgotten in this, but I also would say there has to be consistency in how can you deny Newcastle where other clubs have leadership that you'd question.
It's interesting you talked there about Jurgen Klopp and admiring him as a leader, and it's probably something we've often reflected on the pod. Managers are so often the figurehead of football clubs, where normally in other institutions it'd be the chairman, the chief executives, and from so many clubs we don't get that very often, do we? So that's why we often look to the managers as being the moral voice often of their institution and sort of having to communicate to the fans where they're not the ultimately responsible figure in terms of the decision making. And we saw that with Super League, didn't we, earlier in the year, where managers were sort of put front and centre in those opening days, weren't they, rather than the chief exec and the chairman of the clubs.
I think it's a common theme amongst football clubs. They don't want to put themselves in the firing line, the chairman and the chief executives. So they are quite often prepared to take a back seat and leave it to the managers to take the bullets, and I'm sure this will be what will happen. I mean, I think we're going to see it initially at Newcastle. We're going to see Amanda Staveley and the Reuben brothers being the directors, and they may well be the people who sort of front up the organisation at least to start off with.
I can assure you, by the way, there's still no statement come in, so I'm keeping an eye here. So yeah,
very good.
I'll let you all know if it does drop when we're speaking.
And yeah, and I mean, we've got obviously Steve Bruce is already under a lot of pressure at Newcastle United, and you can perhaps see why, despite the fact that they've been struggling and there have been calls for him to leave, why Mike Ashley hasn't sacked him, because that would have just been money down the drain as far as Mike Ashley is concerned, because everybody expects that the Newcastle will come in and sign a really, really high-profile manager under the new regime, and no doubt go on a massive transfer spending spree in January next summer.
Amnesty just putting a statement in that's just landed now, talking about serious human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, flagging up the dire situation, government critics, women's rights campaigners, Shia activists, human defenders still being harassed and jailed, often after blatantly unfair trials. And this is going to be the really challenging thing for the Premier League to try to say, how does Mohammed bin Salman have no role in this when he is ultimately sitting at the top of the fund and it just happens to be someone else, nominally at least, is the authorised non-exec chairman, the executives, when we know he's sitting ultimately at the top of the company that will now be owning Newcastle United.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing you can say is that they've been fairly, they've not sort of hidden that fact. I mean, if you look, for example, at Manchester City, everybody basically takes a view that they are state-owned by Abu Dhabi. However, Sheikh Mansour, who is the nominal owner, he is and positions himself as being independent of the government. So Saudi Arabia could easily have done that. It could just have had a figurehead there to sit in. But so at least they did actually say it was the PIF, which everybody knows has not just bin Salman but also government ministers on the board. And that is clear and obvious.
How many days or weeks before we're analysing the game only? Oh, well, didn't Newcastle play well today? And actually, it looks like they could get in the top four. And are they going to be Premier League champions? Because that's what happens, isn't it? Inevitably.
Which also for people would provide new narratives and storylines in the league, which are welcomed when we get used to the traditional top four or top six. So an element of actually the footballing side does eventually take over with that. Now, Lee, obviously, the fact you worked for a Qatari broadcaster for so many years, many people from the outside, I'm sure, would have had many assumptions. What did it mean? What freedoms did you have? Did it change how you view the situation with Mid-East sports and how it is to report on something so contentious when ultimately sitting at the top of the Al Jazeera organisation obviously is the Qatari state? And yes, I've been on air with you as well, on Al Jazeera as well at times, as the disclaimer.
That's a really good question. I mean, I was there for a decade and I wasn't put under any pressure at all. I was given, in fact, more freedom than I might have done conceivably from a UK company that had more of a routine with exactly how it expects its broadcasters to deliver. I was able to actually deliver the truth from what I saw, and I was very grateful for that. But in terms of how people from the outside see Qatar and a Qatari organisation, I mean, it was really uncomfortable. I remember being at FIFA reporting on protests outside the gates about the World Cup, and I just had to play. I think you always have to just play it dead straight. This is what's happening and why. Break down what the issue is. So break down, human rights and workers' rights. I mean, there's not much more important than that. So you have to give the facts and make sure that they're held to account too, even if that, puts you in a difficult position. Then, of course, people talk about the actual process for the World Cup being awarded in Qatar, and there's no doubt that that's still massively controversial, as admitted by people at FIFA, because they were saying we shouldn't have awarded 2 World Cups at the same time. They've admitted that much. But in terms of how far beyond that it's an issue, I mean, obviously nothing's ever been proven, and, the World Cup will eventually take place and people will talk about how good the football is and so on. The one thing that I always sort of said, for want of a better way of putting it, in defence of Qatar was the issue with the heat. I said in an interview with the then Secretary General Johan Volker many years ago, why does the World Cup have to be played in June and July? And it was like, well, because it is. And I said, but why? And I think the fact it's moved to November is something that it is the World Cup. The Middle East has a right to stage the World Cup, I think, and that actually, why not play it in November? England might have a better chance of actually winning it in those circumstances. You never know. So I don't. That's the least of the problems. I think you have to make a distinction between the different areas and not just dismiss Qatar and dismiss the World Cup. You have to analyse each one and see where there's a problem to be tackled.
One thing that's changed obviously pretty dramatically in the last sort of 20 years or so, 30 years, is that you are both slightly older than me. In the 1990s, human rights in sport wasn't as much of an issue when we're talking about events, were they? How have you seen that change?
Well, no, I think you're not quite right there, Rob. I mean, I remember covering the vote for the Beijing 2008 games in Moscow in 2001, and human rights was a major issue there.
I saw my 1990s.
So, yeah, yes, obviously that there's more focus, but I still think it has been an issue. But I mean, I just think that the whole landscape is what has really changed is now you have Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi, these oil-rich Gulf states, just seeing sport as an opportunity for everything, pushing their brand, their national brand, sport washing, whatever you want to call it. And I mean, clearly the countries have looked at what Qatar have done with PSG in the World Cup and think, oh, this works, we're going to do it too. And this is now the situation we're left with.
And we can plug this week's podcast as well for an interview. Unfortunately, we couldn't get him down here, but we have recorded him already. Chris Halpin from the NFL, who we did put the question to about whether they'd welcome Gulf ownership there of an NFL franchise. Lee, returning to that question, how have you seen it change in terms of how we as the media focus on these human rights matters when it comes to who owns sport, who runs sport, where sports eventually go to?
It's not just human rights, is it? It's how we look at sport overall that's changed over my time covering it. When I first started, I used to go to matches reporting for Haters, Jerry's company over there, in the early 90s. And you'd just go to the match and report on that. And I do remember a little bit of a mini turning point was when I used to go and cover England games in the mid to late 90s. And you'd suddenly look down and see some terrible violence taking place and think, I'm no longer able to write about who scored the goal. I need to get involved in that. But then sports news, for you guys, I mean, that's become a huge thing. And it's good. It's good that we're looking more into what sport really is and how it's running. And if we didn't do that, some of the things we're told we might accept that are clearly not good for the public. not least such things as the European Super League. I mean, has that fully gone away? And when that happened, some of the virtue signalling that happened around that as well, as if, it was just those pesky club chairmen and those who wanted to invest the money in it, rather than a bigger problem for football and a bigger problem for sport, that, people in sport as in life, they're going to pretend to take the money. And when they take the money, don't pretend it's anything other than that's what's going on. And that's what's happening with Newcastle. This is a business. I mean, Mike Ashley, he's not what they call a football man. He's a businessman. And that's what this is. It's big business. And I do think it's a really uncomfortable relationship between sport and big business.
Sometimes we can lose track with the actual sport itself. So our next guest actually has more of a connection, an actual Olympic gold medalist. No offence to you, Lee, but it's been great to have you on here, and good luck with the launch of the book, The Dilly Dong Bell, coming out soon, and certainly a busy year, particularly in the world of golf politics.
Thank you,
Lee
guys.
Wellings.
Thank you very much.
So we do speak to a lot of analysts and pundits on this podcast, and yet the world of sports news would be nothing without the actual athletes themselves. And joining us now up on stage is someone who's not only been an Olympic gold medalist, appeared at 4 Olympics, but also has got involved in the world of sports politics as well. It's Angela Ruggiero. Welcome to Sport Unlocked Live Edition.
Thank you for having me.
I need to hand you the microphone.
Thank you for having me.
So I believe you've just come from Paris for a meeting of World Rugby. Rugby is not necessarily the sport we associate massively in the United States. How did you get involved with rugby?
Yeah, thank you. I got elected to the IOC in 2010 at my 4th Olympics, representing athletes. So served for 8 years there. And part of that, I helped liaise with the Rugby Federation and got to know them. And when they were looking for another board member, decided to help out. So the benefit of being on the IOC is you get to see, represent athletes from all over the world, every country, every sport, every gender. You really get to kind of take a different perspective than just maybe your country or your sport. And again, I loved rugby, so it's fun to be in this stadium here today.
Obviously a hockey Olympian, no rugby on ice coming.
No, I like the roughness of it, but no, hockey is my favorite sport. Obviously, I was born to play it and enjoyed, competing for Team USA for a decade and a half. It was the honor of a lifetime.
Just conversation we've just been having now about Newcastle United, about golf ownership. How does that seem to you as an outsider looking in?
No, I mean, I think all of these conversations are relevant today. I think a lot of the conversation you've had so far, sports is so much more than just sport, and we all know that. That's why we're in this business. You feel it in your heart. Athletes, I think, recognize their role models. They're more than just athletes, and they have the opportunity to change society, both at the individual and collective level. And I certainly saw that when I was competing and would come home and have my gold medal, and little girls suddenly had someone to look up to, which I didn't as a young woman, or little boys had a woman to look up to. That changed their perspective. So obviously I'm a believer in sport and the power that it has, and we should be having these hard conversations as well, because we want sport to continue to flourish and be relevant in today's ever-changing world.
There's a couple of challenges for rugby at the moment. There's the whole issue around head injuries and training restrictions, contact training restrictions. Is that something you've talked about before? And the other thing I was going to ask you about was there's this concept of a 12-a-side game. It just seems that you've got 7-a-side, you've got 15-a-side, and now there's this proposal coming for a 12-a-side game. Do you have any concerns around that? But I'm particularly interested around this thing about reducing the amount of contact and training to very, very small amounts of time.
Yeah, I'll let the rugby experts in depth debate that. We'd be here forever. But as it relates to health, our job, I think, as sports administrators and sports business owners is to ensure sport is safe. The great thing is we are suddenly learning more about what is and isn't safe in sport. And so it's definitely a topic for everyone. I come from the US. The NFL has been, it's a very relevant topic almost on a daily basis now in the US pertaining to the NFL. So World Rugby takes it very seriously. Obviously, as the former chair of the Athletes Commission, I had concussions when I was younger. So whatever I could do, whatever we could do, I think the first is the awareness of potential downfalls in sport. And so, the concussion, CTE, I just want more science. I want a lot of money being thrown into the research. I want the sports community to come together and not just point the finger and think through how do we tackle any contact sport or any, is going to be facing these similar questions.
And of course, you are involved heavily in the world of technology now. The fact you're incubating startups, aren't you? You're helping to get investment for that. How did you move into the world of technology, and are you actually looking at areas of concussion and dealing with brain injuries in some of the business you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Sports Innovation Lab. About 5 years ago, realized technology was changing fan behavior, and we abstract it, but we're not at the detailed level understanding it. So for the past 5 years, we've studied what we call the fluid fan, this future fan that comes in and out of sport. And technology is the force that is changing all behavior in terms of the fan. So we started the practice. We still have an arm that focuses on this human performance because technology certainly changes athletes. We call it the quantified athlete. There's literally hundreds of companies quantifying performance, preventing injury, helping you understand your sleep patterns, your recovery, the imbalances in your bones or your muscles after a surgery. It's fascinating. I got a little bit of it as I was terming out in 2010, but today's athlete really can quantify themselves in so many ways and perfect their game. And so if you think about, Moneyball, this Moneyball effect, you can start studying athletes and training better, smarter. I thought, why can't we have that same approach to the business side? Why aren't there more objective data-focused companies that can literally measure fandom and help you understand in a similar way we expect from our athletes to perform on the business side? So we're focused on, again, really trying to understand how technology is changing fan behavior, and then how do you have to build your stadiums? How do you have to enhance your media and evolve to meet the fan where they are? How do you have to think about, working with your sponsors in a very different way than slapping a logo on the wall? All the sponsors in the world are big tech companies now. Amazon, we were talking about, before, Amazon just bought the rights to the Kraken. It's an NHL team, if anyone's a hockey fan in the stands. Hockey? No? Anyway. The Kraken, it's the latest NHL franchise, and they bought the rights. They call it the Climate Pledge Arena. They're not even using their logo. These brands want more. And so technology is enabling them to reach these fans in new and innovative ways. So that's what we cover each and every day.
Can I ask you about your experience on the IOC's Ethics Commission? Speaking from a journalist outside, it seems to me this is a sort of the commission is a very, very sort of secretive, looks after its own, doesn't do things transparently, basically tries to brush any problems under the carpet, and if somebody does actually contravene the regulations in a big way, they get them to resign before they actually do anything anyway. That's how it comes across to me. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so I'm no longer on the Ethics Commission, but I did serve for a time, and I think again, we want to govern our athletes, we want to govern our administrators. I think this whole conversation to me is we just want to expect more. We should expect more, both from our athletes and from the people that work within the IOC, from the members themselves, or any private public partnership. Sport is increasingly visible. And so obviously it was an honor to serve on that, trying to enforce and support and make sure that our members were adhering to the rules in the same way if, an athlete's doping or an athlete breaks the rules, they get their medal removed. So again, I hope there's more bodies that are starting ethics commissions or integrity units that, again, look at not just the athletes, but across the entire administrative level.
don't know if you can talk specifics or generally, what were the most sort of challenging areas you had to deal with in terms of ethics? I know certain things that across your plate would have been integrity matters, even things like whether Seb Coe could have his IOC membership because of his conflicts of interest, something Thomas Bach spoke openly about his CSM role. What sort of things were the most challenging when you're sort of assessing ethics in sport and the IOC in particular?
I think one of the hardest challenges is you don't necessarily always have jurisdiction over decisions. And so that is a limiting factor in some ways where, you think about an athlete that dopes in one country and unless WADA is in that, it's the local organizing National Olympic Committee or National Federation. Same thing applies at, the administrative level. So you can't necessarily, rule unless that is within your own jurisdiction. So I'd say that's probably one of the greatest frustrations is, do you have a global body that can really, again, implement across the board? But again, I like to say, the more we can work together, the more these different bodies can come together, and not just for points in time, but through time. I think we'll be better for it.
And you're on the Athlete Commission all the way through the Russia investigations, as McLaren was reporting on the cover-ups by Russia, particularly at Sochi 2014, the deceptions, the state-sponsored doping schemes, a lot of athlete concerns. What was that period like, and does history repeat itself? Will we go through this again in another decade, 20 years, as we had through, previous generations too, such sophisticated attempts to deceive the system?
Unfortunately, I think we'll have another episode where people will try to cheat. I think we've always had cheaters in sport. I hope more money gets invested in, the counter. I think that's always, instead of trying to play catch up, can we get ahead of the cheaters? Again, whether that's doping or the rules or referees, what are the ways technology in some ways is something that I see. Think about goal line technology, ways just to make it fair. Because at the end of the day, as an athlete, you just want an even playing field. You want to know that you showed up. Not everyone's going to have the same opportunity or equipment or training. That's an unfortunate nature of global sport. There's differences of income, etc. But you want to know when you get on that starting line, it's equal. So I would hope, the optimist in me is, wow, hopefully we'll never see that again. But it was a tragic moment, I think, for sports. And, again, hopefully there's more investment made into those countermeasures than just reacting in the moment and trying to, do investigative reporting to really find out what's going on. I'd love us to get far ahead of these kinds of situations.
It's been a couple of years, I think, since you've been on the IOC. What do you think about the way they've changed the appointment of the host cities? You don't really get a proper vote now. You just get one candidate presented to the session, and then it's everybody votes for one candidate. What do you think about that? Because for me, I think it loses some of the competitive aspect of it, gives members much less of a say in what's happening.
This being around how Brisbane got the 2032 games without the normal open process. Yeah.
Well, I was the chief strategy officer of the LA Olympic bid, and on top of having served on the IOC, I was on an evaluation commission. I was on the coordination commission, so I've kind of seen the whole gamut. One thing that I really like about the new process is, and the NFL does this again. I'll reference a league I'm familiar with. You have to align the growth of your game to what your strategy of that game is. And it could be globalization. You want to go to new geographies. It could be a particular market you want to be in. It could be, something that is important to that particular moment in time. And by moving more towards a kind of runoff with internal candidates that align to that strategy versus, hey, you have to, run around the world and try to convince 100 people to vote for you. Again, I think it's a positive evolution of the Olympic movement. And a lot of sporting bodies, I believe, are going to move more in this direction. It's less costly. And at the end of the day, you have to do what's right for your organization. So when Paris and LA, as an example, for the first time ever, were awarded the games at the same time, and we were going for 24, we got 28, but everyone won at the end of the day. We 2 games were awarded in 2 areas that the Olympic moment at that moment in time really wanted the games to be.
Perhaps those who don't win are the consultants and the PRs who've spent so many years building
That's
up.
great. Less leakage, less cost. No, but it's just been so fun, spending time on the Olympic movement. And one area I do want to bring up that I'm super passionate about, this year's Tokyo Olympics, we had almost 50% female participation. And that's something as a female athlete, I'm super proud of, that we moved under Thomas Bach. I was on the commission when we started the Gender Equality Project, and slowly but surely we're moving to equal participation. And the Olympic brand is one of the biggest brands in the world. It gives equal footing to both men and women now, both in promotion and in participation. And that brand continues to grow and grow and grow. And so this past year, I was reflecting on that. Why is the Olympic brand and women's sports in particular so relevant? So my company started something called the Fan Project. And we actually asked fans to help us prove that there was actual demand in women's sports. Because traditionally, we don't measure that demand. We sort of look at Nielsen ratings and say, no one's interested in women's sports. And it's me and my girlfriends talking about, we want more. That wasn't going to be the right approach. We want to take a very logical, analytically driven business approach. So the Fan Project results, when fans gave us their data, GDPR compliant, by the way, it said that there's massive pent-up demand. And actually, the most forward-thinking, fluid, digitally savvy, technology forward fans are fans of women's sports. That's both men and women. And why is that? Well, you can't be a lazy women's sports fan. You have to go on your Reddit communities, download Twitch, find it online. It's actually changed fundamentally the behavior of these fans. So fans of women's sports are leading the way. They're really interesting. Even if you don't care about women's sports, you should pay attention, because you have this really interesting aggregate of your bullseye, of your future fan that you're going to want all of us to build experiences again in the future. And then if you take a step back and you're like, oh, wow, that's interesting. The women's sports community is nimble. You can do things that you don't have the long-term rights fees. You don't have the laborious contracts. You can act like a startup. And so there's I think a lot of interesting data from the Fan Project that we have around this new community-based monetization model. And that's where all sports is headed, where digital communities are the future. And you take that back to the Olympics, when 99.9% of people will never go to an Olympic Games, or the Premier League trying to be global. People won't ever get to attend live. It's all in this digital ecosphere where digital communities exist. And I get really excited about it, because I think, one, the IOC has moved towards equal participation. And the next era for all sports is, how do we get those digital communities together, monetize them, make this as a real business? And I think women's sports is actually ironically in a pole position to do that.
Talking of women's sports, and with both your rugby and your Olympic hats on, FIFA has announced that it's looking at increasing the frequency of the Men's World Cup and the Women's World Cup. They said a bit later on, but certainly the Men's World Cup to every 2 years. What sort of challenges does that pose, A, for the Olympics, and B, for World Rugby? Because that obviously you have a 4-yearly World Cup as well.
Well, I'm happy for the athletes. You get to play more. Who doesn't want to play on a big stage with lots of people? There's complexities with the global sports calendar, but in terms of building a business and being more in front of fans, that is one of the challenges of the Olympics. That's why we launched the Olympic Channel, the digital kind of OTT play. How do you stay relevant in front of fans 24/7, 365, not be an events-based business, which a lot of us, I think, historically, the research we've done and the clients that we help, helping them transition from an events-based business. And if it's once every 4 years, even harder. So the frequency, balance that with health and player safety. You can't obviously do it all and burn these players out. So how do you balance calendar with the demand that when you have a really good piece of content, and that's just not on the field, that's also the storytelling and everything around it. How do you deliver that in a way that keeps fans coming back? So again, I'm not a FIFA expert by any means, but it is hard on the Olympic side every 2 years, or the Rugby World Cup, it's every 2 years, flipping men's and women's. How do you keep these fans engaged, excited, in front of them, because ultimately you want to see the sport and you want your kids to sign up. You want it to move society.
But do you not have, you keep them engaged through other competitions? It doesn't have to be the Olympics. You've got the World Championships of all these.
And that, I think that's the challenge. I'd be curious how many other federations are thinking, hey, we should do ours every 4 years or every 2 years, or we should, I come from hockey. We have a World Championship every year, but we don't have a World Cup. We don't have a big pinnacle event. So the challenge right now, I think in the last decade is there's more competition within sports, and there's more competition with entertainment. The Netflix, the Fortnite. You got to be on top of your game, so to speak, to succeed in this. And so one, I think, response we've seen is just let's increase the frequency of the event rather than really digitally transform and have, to your point, maybe smaller events. But I'm a massive advocate for storytelling. It's a big finding of the FAM project. It's a big success of the Olympics. You want to know about those athletes. Maybe you've never heard of that sport before. But fans of women's sports, we saw in our data, would love 90% shoulder content. The before, during, and after. What are they wearing? What do they care about? Well, you talked a lot before about values and how that's becoming increasingly the 3 macro trends we saw in our data. For all this conversation, I would summarize it as 3 things. 1, society is waking up. It's a societal change. 2, athletes have a voice. They're entertainers now. And then 3, technology is allowing not just fans to communicate, but athletes go direct to consumer. And you have those 3 macro forces coming together. And it's causing, the FIFAs of the world to say, man, how do we stay relevant? Let's maybe do it every 2 years. I don't know.
And of course, in rugby, you have the key thing, which is the World Cup. So just carrying the name, the World Cup. It doesn't say Men's World Cup. It doesn't say Women's World Cup, which is not something we've seen across many sports yet. One of the big challenges facing athletes going into 2022, thinking of your previous athlete commission hat, is Beijing. And we're getting a lot of human rights activists raising concerns, particularly about the treatment of the Uyghur minorities in China. And there'll be calls to protest the games, to boycott the games even. How should athletes navigate that? How do you as an athlete navigate it when, first of all, the decision to award the games there was taken way above you? And for you, it's your chance every 4 years to go to the Olympics.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's something I know the Athletes Commission has been actively discussing for years because, athlete activism is not new. As I mentioned before, technology and this ability for athletes to go direct to consumer, that's new. But athletes have always been activists. Maybe smaller pockets in their own communities, they can speak out, they can tweet out, they can disseminate their thinking and influence society more easily today. And that's important for organizations to recognize. Certainly the IOC is recognizing it and rethinking, what does Rule 50 look like? How do we provide more opportunities for athletes to speak up over the things they care about without infringing on the rights of the athlete that is competing and winning a medal and maybe wants that moment in time just for sport and not for politics. And so again, it was really interesting being the chair of the Athletes Commission because you don't have one view. You have multiple views. You have some athletes saying, let's just do sport. And you have other athletes saying, no, this is why we do sport. And a whole mix and range, just like humanity, of perspectives. And trying to balance that is something I know the former chair, Kirsty Coventry, and the new chair, Emma Terho, are actively trying to figure out for the Olympic athletes.
And as we wrap things up, before we give the audience a chance to think of maybe any questions to put to both of us, see, as we sort of wrap things up, almost bringing it back to how we started this, talking about Saudi Arabia now with Beijing too. Can athletes have more impact? Can sport have more impact by going to these countries and athletes now using their platforms to raise awareness of issues? That can be gender equality or indeed ethical issues as well.
No, it's the IOC has more countries in the UN than the UN represents, more NOCs representing. And I know they've taken that approach to say, let's try to use sport as a platform to bring people together. And I've had that personal experience, in the Olympic Village. I remember our 2006 in Torino, raising the red flag over, Iran, who just announced their nuclear program. We shouldn't walk out. They have this flag raising ceremony in the village. It's awesome. It's like one of the coolest internal things no one ever sees. And that was the moment where all of us stood up and said, absolutely, we walk together. Isn't that the point? So again, I think the awareness of these issues is so important. And increasingly, athletes are going to continue to speak up. And increasingly, they are holding the power. If you look at anyone's social media aggregate of followers, 10, 20, 30, 50 times more on the athlete side than the teams or the properties. The power is in the athlete, the influencer, the entertainer. And so we have to listen to them. And by going to new territories, new geographies, by raising things like gender equality, I hope it raises all of our collective awareness to say, why don't the women have this? Why haven't we been to this geography? Is it because of our own internal biases? So it's a great question. We should, I would like to take the positive approach, and let's use a new territory as an opportunity rather than, simply a threat.
Angela, thank you for joining us here on stage for Sport Unlocked Live. Angela Ruggiero, thank you.
Thank you.
So as we wrap things up, we thought, has anyone got any questions for us at all in the audience? This is really...
There really doesn't have to be.
No. It's fine. We'll give us... we do have a question there. You can say your name and organisation.
Oh, yeah. Hi, I'm Sam. I work at Tottenham Hotspur in the partnerships team. I had a question going back to Newcastle and the Saudi PIF takeover. When we think about what the Saudi and PIF incentives are, I think we normally talk about sports washing. And is it as simple as that? And if it is, it seems to be going pretty disastrously for them so far, I'd suggest.
It's an interesting one, that, because actually, we bring it back to Qatar, and a lot of people say getting the World Cup was about sports washing, but, and we touched on this earlier, there wasn't really that focus on human rights, was there, before the vote in 2010? So there wasn't necessarily anything to wash, it'd be preemptively doing so. But I think with Newcastle, I don't think they foresaw necessarily this ongoing damage and lingering questions over them. And in part, it's linked to the Gulf boycott as well. That started in 2017. That really put this dispute into sharper focus with Qatar, particularly involving sport, because the piracy of the Qatari broadcast as well.
Yeah, you're right. It's not just about sport washing. It's about who had really heard much about Qatar before they were named as the World Cup hosts. Nobody. The same thing with Abu Dhabi and Manchester City. It's a way of putting their name on the map internationally. So it's not sport washing. You're right. It's not quite as narrow as that. There's a sort of broader global geopolitical aspect. That's true.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. And we have another from the floor here.
Des O'Hare from the Sports Ministry. In your 3 minutes and 4 seconds left, I'd invite you to take on 2 questions if you'd be happy to. We've talked a lot about trust in this session, which has been great. I think the Daily Mail reported this week that in 1984, FIFA knew about the link between dementia and head injuries in sport. And they knew about that from their own report in 1984. So 2 questions. One is, how do you think we get to trust organisations like FIFA or the FA again? What do we need to see to be able to rebuild that trust? And the second thing is, particularly in sport, football or rugby, how do you think sport's getting away with ignoring things like the relationship between that sport and dementia? Have we got away with it for so long? It's very recently in the press, but it feels like a scandal that's just not been dealt with properly. So trust, and specifically dementia.
It's interesting, thanks for that. It's a great question. We do cover the issue of how much can we trust these governing bodies very often on the podcast, and it brings back to the Saudi question, because Gianni Infantino, the FIFA president's close relations with Mohammed bin Salman is something that we've looked at. The fact he even recorded a PR video effectively for the state when he was out there in January. And it's about perception, is it, very often? It's about judgment calls of leaders. The language you use, yes, you might need to have a close association with these countries to work together, but it's, do you go that step overboard in terms of perhaps, something I've written about in the past, fawning language towards Vladimir Putin from Gianni Infantino, and trust as well we've seen with this biennial World Cup as well. The fact is the process, there's been so many questions about, can we trust it when that they came to the decision beforehand. They decided they wanted the biennial World Cup, and now they're trying to reverse engineer it almost to try to give us the impression that there's a real process.
Yeah, I mean, that question goes to the heart of regulation of sports, doesn't it? and can sports be trusted to regulate themselves? I mean, I think we've seen in the NFL they basically sat on lots of research that dementia was a big problem for former players. I don't think we've quite seen that with the football bodies. I mean, I think there were indications, but what they didn't do was actively seek out that research until very recently. So that's why it's coming to the forefront now. So, but it's a difficult one. How far do you go down with regulation? Who can regulate FIFA, for example? I mean, in a way it's an impossible question to answer.
And I think the dementia questions over FIFA just shows actually the attitudes of governing bodies for many years. They perhaps wanted it to brush it under the carpet, not put the significant attention, maybe fearing damage to the sport and the popularity, participation and watching it as well. And we see potential financial repercussions for those decisions coming to bear now. As we close up, it looks like we've hit the hour here for the very first live edition of Sport Unlocked. How have you found it? For once, we couldn't stop and start and re-record. We had to do it in one go.
Yeah, no, it's been excellent. Thanks everybody for coming to watch us and contributing as well. And yeah, it's just final sign off that I hope kabaddi is going to be a next Olympic sport. I'll leave Nick and Angela to get their heads together and sort that out.
Yeah, thanks to Nick Howard, to Lee Wellings, Angela Ruggiero here, joined us on stage. Martyn, as ever, thank you everyone for being in the audience. Thank you for hopefully everyone listening as well. And remember, we're on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at Sport Unlocked, so you can always send us your thoughts there for anything we should be discussing, any bigger questions too. But thanks so much for supporting Sport Unlocked.